I'm going to take a wild stab and say you're a big fan of the Red Wall series of books when you were a kid, or perhaps you spent your COVID lockdown committing war crimes with rats in Creative Assembly's Total War games and developed a taste for it. But whatever the case may be, something brought you here because you're thinking about starting a Skaven army for Warhammer the Old World. But a tabletop army is a big investment, not only with money, but in time and effort of putting it together and painting it up. So it's important to know if the faction is a good fit for you before you start. In this video, I'll go over the good, the bad, and the ugly of Skaven in the Old World so you can make an informed decision before you buy anything. And of course, the first thing you have to think of when you think of Skaven for the Old World is their legacy status. So as a brief overview, when Games Workshop brought back Warhammer Fantasy, they split up all the existing factions into two categories, supported factions and legacy factions. And I mean, the names of these categories are pretty abundantly clear. The supported armies are stated to continue to get new units, new rules, and support for the Old World, while these legacy status armies got their initial free PDF, but are not expected to get anything else. And this means basically no rules updates for Skaven, no buffing to weak units, and I wouldn't even expect much from FAQs as they clarify rules going forward. But worst of all, it means no arcane journals. And if you don't know, arcane journals are supplements that are being released for the supported factions that include a couple of different ways to play the faction and usually a new unit or new hero or two. Unfortunately, this also puts legacy factions like Skaven at risk of being power creeped out of the game. As new stuff gets released, new rules come out, new units come out, etc., it is possible that these new rules, it's even likely that these new rules end up increasing the power level of these supported armies, and the legacy armies will fall further and further behind. This would theoretically take years to happen, but the game could get to the point where the legacy factions are so far behind that they are no longer enjoyable to play at all. And this is especially concerning for Skaven, which were not that strong on release. And that's the pretty standard spiel on legacy status. However, there have been some new, let's say, rumors come out that may change this quite a bit. So I will try to keep this as brief as possible, but basically there is a person on the Warhammer Discords who has been leaking information about the Old World and has been very accurate in the past. For example, he correctly predicted the mining carts for dwarves and that the Empire of Man are coming out before High Elves, correctly before anyone else has talked about these. And what he has recently said is that due to the unexpected financial success of the Old World, GW is now given the green light to re-explore these legacy factions for the Old World, starting with the vampire counts. But before you get too excited, do keep in mind that Games Workshop is the company version of a cursed monkey paw. So while they may be taking a second look at these legacy factions, it's stated that they will not come back the same way we know them. To use the leaker's analogy, it's like we all like ketchup and we all want ketchup, and so GW's thinking, okay, well, we're not going to give them ketchup, but we will give them mustard, which is still a condiment. And most people has taken that metaphor to mean that we'll receive the legacy factions in some way, but they'll be different than the past and probably focus on a sub-faction, maybe Vampire Coast instead of Vampire Counts. For Skaven, the most common idea for this is that we'll receive a Clan Pestilence style list rather than Skaven as a whole for the Old World. This is further backed up because Skaven just got refreshed for Age of Sigmar, but there's no Clan Pestilence themed unit in sight. And again, I do want to emphasize that this is just a rumor from a leaker, and you should also keep in mind that even if this does happen, the timeline for it is probably years ahead, maybe 2026 at the earliest, and that's pretty optimistic. But if your goal is to start a Skaven army now, this is definitely something you have to keep in mind, especially if the faction comes back in a different form than what you're used to. If, for example, you build a Skaven army now and you build it with a lot of their engineering wonders, and then GW comes back and saying, okay, well now Clan Pestilence are supported for the Old World, but a lot of those units won't be valid anymore. If you spent the money on these and painted them up and then GW says your faction's coming back but not in a way you can currently play, that can be incredibly frustrating. I don't know what the right answer to this is, especially given that the clan pestilence aspect of this is very much just speculation, but it might be something you should consider hedging your bets for. So yeah, but it's not all bad news. Models are in a very good place for Skaven when it comes to the old world. Skaven might be a legacy army in the old world, but they're still around for Age of Sigmar, and in this edition they're getting a big focus. And that means Skaven are getting tons of new kits and they all look really great, and most of them seem like they'll rank up very well. These new clan rats are certainly more innate and a little bit more dynamic posed, but I do think you should be able to mix in the new clan rats with some of the old clan rats and still look pretty okay, which is a really nice perk. I think the same thing holds true for the new weapon teams and the new characters. I think all of these could be used for the old world very easily, which is very nice. The only new kit that I think would give me pause for trying to rank up are the new Storm Vermin. They look really great, don't get me wrong, but so many of them have their weapons down or facing out in front of them, they'd be incredibly hard to rank up unless you were very careful. For these, you might think about sourcing from the old kit. And getting your hands on these models shouldn't be too bad at all. As of this recording, the new Skaven kits are not available individually, they are just part of the new AOS starter kit. But that is actually a really good thing. You should be able to go to some of the miniature trading subreddits or Facebook group and be able to buy just the Skaven half of the starter kit for people who just want the Storm cast. Additionally, if you still prefer the older kits for these units, you're going to have a lot of Age of Sigmar players looking to upgrade their old units to these new ones, and they're going to sell their old ones for very cheap. You just have to put them on a square base. You should be able to find a lot of good deals right now. This is a really good time to be buying Skaven models. The only downside to the physical presence of Skaven on the tabletop right now is you need a lot of models. This is definitely a horde army, and you will be painting a lot of clan rats who won't last on the board very long. But on the other hand, the downside is if they haven't been previewed to be part of the refresh already, I wouldn't expect it to happen. Two units that are very strong in the old world, Gutter Runners and Globadiers, are some of the oldest sculpts GW still produces, and they are very much showing their age. We do know that the Globadier is going to get a refresh. We've seen in preview, the new sculpts look great, especially in comparison to the old. However, that was the last of the previews from GW, so I wouldn't expect these Night Runners, these Gutter Runners, to receive an update anytime soon, which is very unfortunate in the old world because they are one of your better units, but will look pretty rough on the tabletop, and the same can be said for some of the other older Skaven units. It would be my recommendation to look for a third-party seller for these Eshin Rats and even Globadiers if you can't wait for the GW release, just because their old sculpts are hard to work with and not nearly as nice as some of the new ones, and these third-party sellers will look better next to your other newer Skaven if those are the sculpts that you decide to use. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to Skaven in the old world is how they play on the tabletop, and unfortunately, that's probably the worst part about them right now. In previous editions, Skaven did two things very well. They massed infantry to bog down units, and they had very strong artillery, and a special rule where the artillery could fire into their own units, killing both. Not only was this thematic and fun, but it made the Skaven army on tabletop really strong as long as the dice were going your way. In the old world, all of these strengths are really gone. Artillery got a universal nerf, Skaven don't have Skaven slaves anymore, which allowed you to bring a lot of models for very cheap, and on top of that, infantry's not that good anyways, and Skaven lost their special rule where they could use all of their artillery to shoot into their own units. They can't do that in the same way anymore, and they seem to have been given very little to compensate this. But the biggest issue you will have if you bring Skaven to the tabletop for the old world is the army does not have a good way to deal with dragons. And in this edition, large monstrous units and heroes are king. Everyone's going to bring those. If there's an army capable of bringing a dragon, they are probably going to bring it unless you have a discussion beforehand and ask them not to. If you go into a game store blind, your opponent is almost guaranteed to bring a dragon or an equivalent thereof, like a Duke on Pegasus. It's just the way that the system is set up this time. And with the nerf to artillery and no strong flying units of their own, Skaven's only answer to dragons is to hope your opponent makes a mistake or throw a lot of points at it. And that's not to say that Skaven don't have good units or strong units or good combos, because they have all those things. And you can absolutely win as Skaven. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I am saying it's going to be harder as Skaven than if you picked a different faction. And if this is your first foray into a tabletop game, this might not be a very good faction to start with. It's going to be an uphill battle. And I think even if you're very experienced with a tabletop game and play your Skaven very well, you're going to experience moments of frustration where you feel like you outplayed your opponent but still lost. And that all being said, I love seeing a painted Skaven army on the tabletop, and especially if you're playing it in a casual group or a group with friends, you should be talking to them beforehand anyways to talk about setting up balanced lists against each other. You should be able to tell your friends, hey, don't bring your dragon when I'm bringing my Skaven, and it'd probably be more fun for both players. All right, and that's my spiel this time. Hopefully I gave you some things to think about, both pros and cons, and as always, thanks for watching.